Hello, I'm Rich from Medieval History Buff. Two things before the video starts. Firstly, and most importantly, I have specifically chosen not to talk about the sexuality of Edward II and Piers Gaveston, as I believe that's one of history's unknowables, and to me, somebody's sexuality is entirely for them, and I feel I have no right to speculate on the subject. I know what I do think, but I'm not going to get into that territory, as I believe it's a little bit disrespectful to start talking about somebody's sexuality, however long ago they may have lived. These were real people with real emotions, so I always feel like I should treat them as you'd want to be treated now. And secondly, if you like the video, think about hitting the like and subscribe button, and also don't forget to share. And lastly, please leave a comment in the comment section, because I do appreciate comments when I get them. I don't get that many, but when I do, they're almost universally positive, and I do appreciate them. Edward II, as far as medieval monarchs go, is rather likeable, affable, and a king comfortable around the common people. He is known to have spent much time talking with folk who might have been considered by others to have been unworthy of his time, and he treated them with kindness and respect. Edward also liked to get his hands dirty and take part in laborious tasks such as digging ditches and building walls. These activities certainly would have been considered below the king's esteem, and there were many sneering comments at Edward's hobbies. From a modern standpoint, this all makes Edward relatable and actually quite likeable, as I mentioned, but for the nobility in the early 14th century, they would have viewed him as being something of an oddball. However, they would have been able to overlook all of this had Edward not taken personal favourites and allocated to them undue power and influence. Later in his reign, Edward would be guilty of this with the Despencer family, which would eventually lead to his downfall. But here, we focus on Edward's most famous favourite, Piers Gaveston. Of Gascon origin, Piers made a quick impression on Edward whilst Edward was still only a prince. Edward's father, Edward I, was not impressed by the influence that Piers was beginning to have on his heir. Piers had initially pleased the king with good conduct and an ability as a soldier, but the growing bond between Piers and Prince Edward soon changed matters. The old king was suspicious enough of his son. As I have already mentioned, the younger Edward showed little to no inclination towards more kingly activities, and instead applied himself to tasks that would be of no use to him if and when he succeeded as king. In 1307, Prince Edward requested that Piers be granted some of Edward's own lands. The king was furious. After launching a verbal tirade on the prince, and possibly physical as well, the king then banished Piers from England, and Prince Edward was for a time banished from King Edward I's court. That same year of 1307, Edward I died, and his son became Edward II. Piers was immediately restored to favour, after receiving the backing of some of the nobles, but by no means all of them. King Edward made Piers Earl of Cornwall. Piers, though, was not a popular man. Despised for his over-inflated ego and arrogance, Piers seemed to now view himself as second only to the king. But for all the hostility that was beginning to grow against Piers, Edward stood firmly by his favourite's side, and if anything, his affection seems to have grown even stronger the more disapproval the relationship between the two received. To strengthen Piers's position, Edward then had him married to the daughter of the late Earl of Gloucester, Gilbert de Clare. This strengthened the ties between Piers and his allies. Shortly after the burial of Edward I at Westminster Abbey, Edward held a tournament in honour of Piers. This absolutely infuriated Piers's enemies. Unsurprisingly, Piers, at the tournament, did nothing to enhance his reputation, and instead added more fuel to the fire. Whilst on his side there was no real men of genuine influence, he had a large number of young knights and outnumbered his rivals significantly. On his enemy's side included the Earls of Hereford and Arundel. Unsurprisingly, Piers won, and he left the tournament greatly enriched by the spoils that he had taken, but with a growing enmity against him. His victory at the tournament only made Piers more and more insufferably arrogant, and he viewed the barons who so hated him as completely beneath him. They, on the other hand, viewed Piers as nothing but a foreign upstart who came from humble and relatively obscure origins. The situation between the two sides was bubbling dangerously. In 1308, Edward married the daughter of Philip IV of France, Isabella. She was about 12 years old at the time of the marriage. Whilst the king was away, Piers had been rather remarkably, and unwisely, left as guardian of the kingdom. Edward, though, returned soon after with his new wife, Isabella, alongside him, and made preparations for the coronation that had yet to take place. At the coronation, Piers placed himself right at the front of proceedings, and eventually completely overshadowed the young girl. Isabella was not happy about this, and she contacted her father about the situation with Piers. Philip would soon develop a deep dislike of Piers, and he would also not exactly be overly enamoured with Edward. After the coronation, an oath was sworn by the earls and barons to never cease until Piers had been driven from the kingdom. The coronation had been one step too far. Apart from the king, the only other man of significance to take up Piers's defence was a certain Hugh Despenser, who, like Piers, was a self-serving individual and would ultimately go the same way as Gaveston. Hugh only spoke up in defence of Piers as he sought to continue to curry the favour of Edward II. It was not done through some sense of righteousness, but merely looking after his own ends. However, the discontent grew rapidly, and civil war was becoming a serious possibility. It eventually dawned on the king, and as well on Piers, that the only thing for it was for Piers to leave England, and after setting sail from Bristol, Piers headed for Ireland. Edward had brought this situation on himself. He had allowed his favourite to massively indulge himself with lavish spending, so much so that the barons felt the country was having to financially support two kings. But Edward would not accept the situation, and Piers would return from exile again, and he did so in secret. Edward had managed to bring this about through a combination of a surprising amount of guile on his part, and also through bribery. He did such a good job of clearing the path for Piers's return from Ireland that only the Earl of Warwick, Guy de Beauchamp, stood firmly against him. De Beauchamp hated Piers. This was an apparent triumph for the king, and he greeted Piers joyfully at Chester in the summer of 1309. Had this second period of exile done anything to humble Piers? No. He started referring to his enemies with charming nicknames such as Burstbelly for the Earl of Lincoln, the Black Dog of Arden for Warwick, and the Fiddler for the Earl of Lancaster. Piers' inability to read the room is quite amazing, and a display of such astonishing arrogance to nickname his enemies with such insulting nicknames. And the king now was once again being threatened with war and deposition. Philip IV ordered Edward to pay him homage. However, Edward was unnerved. He could not possibly hope to leave Piers as guardian in the current climate. A group of 21 barons, known as the Ordainers, demanded reform in the government and for Piers to be expelled once again. The ordinances of 1311 had come after Edward had led a fruitless expedition into Scotland, and one of the demands was to limit Edward's ability to go to war without widespread consent. Unsurprisingly, another clause was to limit his ability to distribute lands and territory, and finally it officially exiled Piers once again. Edward tried to squirm his way out of trouble by attempting his previous tactic of flattery and bribery, but this time it was to no avail. If he didn't agree to the ordinances, then he would very likely face deposition. Edward was left with no choice, and so had to agree to the barons' demands. The ordinances made very clear the crimes that Piers was accused of. Firstly, of advising the king badly and leading the country to the brink of civil war. He had unjustly enriched himself at the expense of the nation. He was blamed for Edward's dismal efforts in Scotland, which had gone against the general wishes of the nobility, and he is also accused of enabling murders and thefts on a wide scale. The crimes are numerous and diverse in their range, but to say this was all Piers's fault would be naive. Edward certainly has to take his share of the blame, as his realm descended into chaos. So once again, Piers went into exile, this time to Flanders, towards the end of 1311, around November time. However, at the very beginning of 1312, he was back. One of the reasons that Piers had given for his return was the hostility he had faced from the French king, Philip IV, who was not pleased with the attention that Edward had been given to Piers instead of his queen, Isabella, Philip's daughter. So it seems fairly natural for Piers to not want to be too near the French king. However, it was much more unwise for him to return to England, even if it was for the sake of his pregnant wife, which is also another reasonable excuse, although it still probably does not justify Piers's returning to England. But this time there will be no escape for Piers, and he was soon besieged at Scarborough by the Earl of Lancaster. Terms were made, and Piers might have thought he could wriggle out of another precarious situation, and indeed, for a time, it looked like he might. But this time he fell into the hands of the Earl of Warwick, who absolutely detested him more than anybody else, and so Piers eventually had death pronounced upon him by the Earls of Warwick, Lancaster, and a handful of others. He wept and he pleaded wretchedly for his life, but there was no way out this time, and he was ran through by the sword of a Welshman, whose compatriot then beheaded Gaveston. This was the end of Piers's relatively brief political career. He was no older than 28 when he died, and it would be very easy to simply put the blame all on Piers for the troubles that had been caused. But Edward II was a terrible judge of character, and he would fatally fall into the same trap with the Despensers, which would see Edward eventually deposed by his own wife Isabella, who he had sidelined for Piers. Isabella proved to be a queen not to be trifled with, and Edward failed to recognise that, as well as failing to recognise that the Despensers and Piers were of absolutely no good to his reign. So if a little less naivety from Edward had been demonstrated, and a little more humility from Piers had been demonstrated, then disaster could have been averted for both of them.